Class, attention, stand up. Good, now face me.
In the archives of a small county historical society in rural Pennsylvania, there exists a photograph that has puzzled researchers for decades. It is a classroom portrait, taken in 1919, showing 32 children arranged in neat rows before a wooden schoolhouse wall. Their faces are solemn, as was customary for the era, when photography still demanded stillness and patience. The teacher sits centered in the front row, her hands folded primly in her lap, her expression unreadable beneath the constraints of early 20th century propriety. At first glance, the image offers nothing remarkable. The children wear simple cotton dresses and wool trousers, their hair combed and parted with the kind of care that speaks to mothers who rose before dawn. The classroom behind them is sparse but orderly. A chalkboard, a few wooden desks pushed to the edges, a single window allowing pale winter light to filter through. Everything about the photograph suggests routine, discipline, the quiet machinery of education in a bygone America. But the photograph refuses to remain ordinary. It was discovered in 2003, tucked inside a leather portfolio among tax records and land deeds, with no accompanying documentation beyond a single handwritten line on the back. March 14, 1919. Miss Whitmore's class. The date was written in careful script. The ink faded to the color of old tea. For years, the image sat in a filing cabinet, acknowledged but not examined, one artifact among thousands in a collection spanning 2 centuries. Then a graduate student researching educational history in Pennsylvania's coal regions noticed something that should not have been possible. According to every county record, every school board ledger, every superintendent's report from that winter, the schools in that district were not open on March 14, 1919. They had been closed for 3 weeks, and they would remain closed for another 2. The question hung in the air like dust motes caught in afternoon light. Why was this photograph taken on a day when no classes should have been in session? The discovery prompted a deeper investigation. Archivists pulled files that had not been touched in generations. Historians began tracing the names of students, the employment records of teachers, the fragile threads of memory that connect the present to a past growing more distant with every passing year. What they found was not an answer, but an invitation into something far more unsettling. A moment frozen in time that should never have been captured at all. The children in the photograph do not smile, but that is not unusual for the period. What is unusual is the way they hold themselves, as if braced against something unseen. Their eyes, when examined closely, carry a quality that transcends the stiffness required by slow shutter speeds. There is a tension in their small shoulders, a uniformity to their expressions that feels rehearsed rather than natural. And there is the date itself, written with such precision on the back of the photograph, as if the person who recorded it knew that someday, someone would need to know exactly when this image was taken. As if the date mattered more than the faces. As if the act of documentation carried a weight beyond memory or sentiment. The photograph measures 8 inches by 10, printed on thick cardstock that has yellowed but not crumbled. The edges are clean, suggesting it was stored with care, perhaps even hidden with intention. There are no other photographs from that school from that year in the entire collection. This single image stands alone, an anomaly that resisted explanation for nearly a century. Researchers began with the simplest questions. Who were these children? Who was Miss Whitmore? What was happening in March of 1919 that would lead to a school being closed, yet a photograph being taken? The answers, when they came, arrived slowly, reluctantly, like confessions drawn from witnesses who had kept silent too long. But before those answers could be understood, it was necessary to understand the date itself, a date that, according to every official record, should not exist in the history of that school. A date that marked not a day of learning, but a day of something else entirely. The handwriting on the back of the photograph is meticulous, the kind formed in an era when penmanship was taught as rigorously as arithmetic. March 14, 1919. Miss Whitmore's class. 13 words that should have been unremarkable, a simple label for a simple image. But when cross-referenced with the records of the Clearfield County Board of Education, those words became impossible. According to the official meeting minutes from February 25, 1919, all schools in the district were ordered closed effective February 28, with no reopening date specified. The closure was not a surprise. It was part of a pattern that had gripped the nation for months. The influenza pandemic that had killed millions worldwide was experiencing a deadly resurgence, and rural Pennsylvania was not immune. Towns that had thought themselves past the worst were burying neighbors again, watching the disease claim those who had survived the first wave only to fall in the second. A local historian named Margaret Salter first noticed the discrepancy while cataloging the county's educational records for digitization. She had spent 6 months piecing together attendance records, budget reports, and correspondence between school superintendents and the state education department. The records painted a grim picture of that winter. Classrooms emptied by illness, teachers working without pay because county funds had been diverted to emergency medical expenses, families keeping children home not only from fear of infection but because they were needed to care for the sick or work in place of parents who had died. Salter pulled the superintendent's correspondence from March 1919. In a letter dated March 10, Superintendent Howard Griggs wrote to the state board, "We remain closed indefinitely. The situation has not improved. We have lost 2 teachers this month and several more are unwell. Resumption of classes is impossible at present." For days later, according to the photograph, 32 children and their teacher gathered in a classroom for a portrait. The contradiction demanded explanation. Salter reached out to other archives, to historical societies in neighboring counties, to genealogical researchers who had traced families from that era. She found newspaper clippings from the Clearfield Progress, the local paper that had documented the crisis week by week. The March 13th edition carried a notice from the county health officer warning residents to avoid gatherings, to keep children at home, to maintain vigilance. The March 20th edition reported 3 more deaths in the township where the school was located. But there was no mention of the school reopening. No announcement that classes had resumed. No indication that on March 14, 1919, any students set foot in any classroom in that district. Salter examined the photograph again, this time with a conservator's loupe, searching for any sign of manipulation or forgery. Early 20th century photography was difficult to fake, but not impossible. Composite images existed, created by skilled darkroom technicians for novelty or commercial purposes. But the photograph showed no evidence of tampering. The lighting was consistent across all faces. The shadows fell naturally. The grain of the image was uniform. This was a genuine photograph, taken on a single occasion in a single place. Which meant that on March 14, 1919, 32 children and their teacher gathered in a classroom that should have been empty, in a school that should have been locked, on a day when such a gathering violated every safety protocol and official order in place. Someone made the decision to bring those children together. Someone arranged them in rows. Someone operated the camera. And someone wrote the date on the back, with a precision that suggested it mattered very much that the exact day be remembered. The closure order remained in effect until April 7, 1919, according to the superintendent's records. The photograph, taken nearly a month before that date, represented not a moment of normalcy but an act of deliberate defiance, or something worse. Salter compiled her findings into a preliminary report and presented them at a regional history conference. The response was immediate. Other researchers came forward with similar anomalies from the same period. Records that did not align, dates that contradicted official timelines, stories passed down through families that spoke of days when children were taken from their homes for reasons their parents were never told. The photograph was no longer a simple artifact. It had become evidence of an event that someone, somewhere, had decided needed to be documented, even as every official mechanism of the time insisted that no such event was taking place. The children in the image were not there for a lesson. They were there for something else. And the careful preservation of the photograph, its storage among legal documents rather than family albums, suggested that someone understood its significance, and wanted it hidden in plain sight until the right person asked the right questions. But what event could require such documentation? What purpose could justify gathering children during a pandemic, in defiance of public health orders and at risk to their lives? The answer lay not in the date alone, but in what was happening during that terrible winter, not just in Pennsylvania but across a nation still reeling from war, disease, and a social order that was fracturing under pressures no one fully understood. When digital enhancement technology became available to historical archivists in the early 2010s, the photograph was among the first items Margaret Salter submitted for analysis. The original image, while well preserved, carried the limitations of 1919 photographic equipment. Soft focus, limited contrast, details that blurred into shadow. Modern scanning techniques could extract information invisible to the naked eye, revealing textures and expressions that time and technology had obscured. The results were unsettling. At high resolution, the faces of the children took on a quality that transcended the expected stiffness of early photography. Their eyes, once merely serious, now appeared fixed with an intensity that suggested something beyond the discomfort of holding still for a camera's long exposure. Several children gripped the edges of their desks with white-knuckled force. Their small fingers pressed so hard into the wood that the tension was visible even a century later. Others sat with hands clenched in their laps, shoulders drawn up as if bracing against a cold that the season alone could not explain. The spacing of the children was irregular. Early school photographs typically showed careful arrangement, with students positioned to create visual balance and ensure that every face was clearly visible. But in this image, gaps appeared between certain children, as if they had been instructed to maintain distance from one another. 3 children in the back row stood slightly apart from the others, their isolation subtle but unmistakable. In the front row, a girl of perhaps 7 years old sat with her head tilted at an angle that spoke not of curiosity but of exhaustion or disorientation. And then there was the child on the far left of the third row, a boy who appeared to be 9 or 10 years old. In every other face, the long exposure time had captured stillness. Eyes focused on the camera, expressions frozen in obedience to the photographer's instructions. But this boy's face carried a blur, a softening at the edges that suggested movement at the moment the shutter clicked. His mouth was slightly open, his eyes caught mid-blink or mid-turn, as if he had looked away just as the exposure began. Dr. Raymond Kellner, a forensic photographer who had worked with law enforcement and historical institutions, examined the enhanced image at Salter's request. His analysis focused on the technical aspects of early photography, exposure times, lighting conditions, the capabilities of cameras available in 1919. A typical classroom portrait from that era would have required an exposure time of 1 to 3 seconds, depending on available light. Any significant movement during that period would have resulted in blur or ghosting, rendering the subject nearly invisible or creating a double image. The boy's face showed blur, but not complete loss of definition. Kellner estimated that the movement had occurred in the final half-second of the exposure, a brief shift that the camera captured as a softening rather than a complete distortion. But what caught Kellner's attention was not the movement itself, but the lack of reaction from those around him. In group photographs where one subject moved, it was common to see others glancing toward the disturbance, their attention drawn by unexpected motion. In this photograph, no one looked at the boy. No one's expression changed. The other children remained fixed forward, as if trained to ignore whatever was happening beside them. Kellner noted other details. The lighting in the room came from a single window on the right side of the frame, casting shadows that helped determine the time of day, late morning or early afternoon, based on the angle of light. But the illumination was uneven, with the left side of the room significantly darker. This suggested either that curtains were partially drawn or that something was blocking the natural light. In an era when electricity was not yet standard in rural schoolhouses, and when photography required maximum available light, the partial obstruction seemed like an odd choice for a photographer trying to capture clear images of 32 children. The teacher, Miss Whitmore, sat centered in the front row, her positioning traditional for the period. But enhanced resolution revealed details that complicated her apparent composure. Her hands, folded in her lap, were pressed together with visible tension. Her jaw was set in a way that suggested clenched teeth, and her eyes, while directed toward the camera, carried a flatness that Kellner described as performative presence. She is there, but not engaged. It was the expression of someone fulfilling an obligation rather than participating in a moment worth preserving. Behind the group, the classroom wall showed faint marks that had been invisible in the original photograph. Enhanced imaging revealed what appeared to be nail holes, evenly spaced, as if something had recently been removed, perhaps maps or educational charts, items that would normally decorate a functioning classroom but were absent in this image. The chalkboard, visible over the teacher's left shoulder, was clean and blank, showing no evidence of recent use. The desks pushed to the edges of the room suggested the space had been cleared for the photograph, but also that it had not been used for teaching in some time. One child in the second row wore a coat despite being indoors. 2 others had scarves wrapped loosely around their necks. The inconsistency in clothing suggested they had not been in the building long enough to warm up, or that the building itself was unheated. In March in Pennsylvania, a school without heat would have been nearly unbearable for extended periods. Yet another indication that this gathering was brief, organized for a specific purpose rather than sustained educational activity. The children's expressions, viewed individually, told stories that the group image obscured. A girl in the front row had eyes that were slightly swollen, as if from recent crying. A boy in the back row stared at the camera with such intensity that his face seemed to vibrate with suppressed emotion. Another child, barely visible on the far right, had turned his head just enough that his face fell into shadow, making his features indistinct. Whether by accident or design, it was impossible to say. These were not the faces of children excited to return to school after a long absence. These were not the expressions of students gathered for an ordinary class portrait. These were faces holding something back, bearing something too heavy for their years, performing stillness for a camera that was documenting not a celebration but an obligation. And someone had decided that this moment, with all its tension and strangeness, needed to be preserved. To understand the photograph, it is necessary to understand the world in which it was taken. The year 1919 did not arrive with hope or renewal. It arrived weighed down by grief, shaped by crises that had tested every institution and shattered the illusion that progress and civilization could protect humanity from its own fragility. The Great War had ended only months before, in November 1918, but the peace felt hollow. Pennsylvania had sent more than 300,000 men to fight, and more than 8,000 had not returned. Those who did come home brought with them injuries visible and invisible. Missing limbs, lung damage from gas attacks, minds fractured by horrors that polite society refused to discuss. Rural communities, already struggling with poverty and isolation, absorbed the trauma without resources or language to process what had happened. Families that had lost sons found no comfort in armistice, only the permanent absence at the dinner table and the flag folded in a drawer. And beneath the grief of war lay the greater catastrophe of disease. The influenza pandemic that swept the globe in 1918 killed more people than the war itself. Estimates ranged from 50 to 100 million dead worldwide, with 675,000 deaths in the United States alone. Pennsylvania was among the hardest hit states. In Philadelphia, 12,000 died in 6 weeks. In smaller towns and rural counties, the death toll was proportionally devastating. Entire families were wiped out. Children were orphaned by the hundreds. Graveyards filled faster than coffins could be built. The disease did not respect the optimism of spring. After a brief lull in late 1918, the virus returned in a second wave in early 1919, and then a third in the spring. Communities that believed they had survived found themselves burying neighbors again. Schools that had reopened briefly were forced to close once more. Churches, meeting halls, and theaters were shuttered. Public gatherings were banned by health authorities desperate to slow the spread. In rural Pennsylvania, where the photograph was taken, the situation was compounded by economic desperation. The coal mines that sustained the region's economy had been operating at reduced capacity during the war, and returning miners found work scarce and wages depressed. The cost of food had risen sharply during the war and remained high, even as family incomes shrank. Many households depended on children's labor. Boys worked in the mines or on farms, girls worked in textile mills or as domestic help, and the loss of that income when schools were closed created impossible choices for parents already struggling to feed their families. But the schools themselves were not simply places of learning. In the early 20th century, rural schools served as community centers, polling places, emergency shelters, and sites for public health initiatives. School teachers were often among the most educated people in small towns, expected to serve not only as instructors but as informal social workers, mediators, and representatives of government authority. When a crisis struck, schools became infrastructure for response, sometimes in ways that were documented, and sometimes in ways that were not. During the pandemic, schools were used as temporary hospitals when existing medical facilities were overwhelmed. They became distribution points for relief supplies, places where food and medicine were handed out to families too poor or too sick to travel to larger towns. They were also used for quarantine, spaces where individuals suspected of infection could be isolated from their families and communities, held until they recovered or until the danger passed. And in some cases, schools became sites for darker necessities that officials preferred not to discuss in public records. When orphanages filled beyond capacity, children were housed temporarily in school buildings, sleeping on floors in classrooms that smelled of chalk dust and disinfectant. When families could no longer care for children, due to death, illness, or economic collapse, those children were sometimes gathered in schools to await placement with relatives or institutions. When immigrant families fell under suspicion during the xenophobic panic that accompanied the war and its aftermath, their children were sometimes removed and held in schools while their parents' status was investigated. These uses of school buildings were rarely documented in ways that would be easily discovered decades later. There were no official programs, no federal oversight, no public debates. Local officials made decisions based on immediate need and limited resources, and those decisions were recorded, if at all, in ways that obscured their true nature. A ledger entry might note facility use, without specifying what the facility was used for. A letter might refer to temporary accommodations, without naming who was being accommodated or why. The photograph, taken during this period of crisis and confusion, suggests a purpose beyond education. The children gathered in that classroom were not there to learn geography or recite multiplication tables. They were there because someone with authority had decided they needed to be documented, counted, recorded, made visible to a camera, even as the official narrative insisted that schools were closed and children were safe at home. The year 1919 was a time when institutions strained under pressures they had not been designed to handle. The machinery of government, education, and public health functioned not through transparency and accountability, but through improvisation and expedience. People did what they believed necessary to survive the immediate crisis, and they trusted that history would either forget or forgive what had been done in desperation. But the photograph did not forget. Someone had preserved it, hidden among legal documents, waiting for a time when the questions it raised might finally be asked. Her name was Lydia Whitmore, and according to the employment records of the Clearfield County Board of Education, she began teaching at the Woodland Road School in September 1917. She was 26 years old at the time, unmarried, and had completed 2 years of normal school, the standard teacher training for rural educators in that era. Her salary was $40 per month, paid irregularly due to the county's financial difficulties during the war. The records described her as competent and disciplined, qualities valued in an era when classroom management often meant maintaining order among 40 children of varying ages in a single room. She boarded with a local family, the Hendersons, who lived a quarter mile from the schoolhouse. She attended church on Sundays at the Methodist chapel. She was, by all accounts preserved in the sparse documentation of the time, unremarkable, one of thousands of young women who spent their youth teaching in rural schools before marriage or family obligations pulled them away. But the records contained gaps, silences that became more noticeable the closer researchers looked. In June 1919, 3 months after the photograph was taken, Lydia Whitmore's employment with the Clearfield County Schools ended. There was no formal resignation letter in her file, no documentation of her reasons for leaving, no forwarding address provided for the final payment of her salary. The June payroll ledger simply noted her name crossed out, replaced by Emma Kessler, temporary. Margaret Salter attempted to trace Whitmore's movements after she left the school. Census records from 1920 showed no Lydia Whitmore in Clearfield County or any of the surrounding counties. Marriage records from Pennsylvania and neighboring states turned up no one with that name and approximate age marrying in the years following 1919. Death records yielded nothing. It was as if she had simply vanished from the documentary record, a not uncommon occurrence for women of that era, who often disappeared into marriages that changed their names or into moves that carried them beyond the reach of official record-keeping. But then Salter found a letter. It was tucked into a folder of correspondence between the Clearfield County Superintendent and the State Department of Public Instruction, part of a routine audit of teacher qualifications conducted in 1920. The letter was dated May 18, 1919, and was written by Howard Griggs, the county superintendent. It was addressed to a Dr. Samuel Brennan, whose title was listed as Special Investigator, State Health Board. The letter was brief and careful in its language. Regarding your inquiry about the events of March at Woodland Road School, I confirm that Miss Lydia Whitmore fulfilled her duties as instructed and cooperated fully with county officials. She has expressed a desire to conclude her employment due to personal reasons, and I have accepted her resignation effective end of term. I trust this matter is now closed and requires no further attention from your office. The letter raised more questions than it answered. What events in March required investigation by the State Health Board? What duties had Whitmore been instructed to fulfill that went beyond her role as a teacher? And why would her cooperation with those duties lead to her resignation? Salter contacted descendants of the Henderson family, with whom Whitmore had boarded. An elderly woman named Patricia Henderson, great-granddaughter of Whitmore's landlords, agreed to search her family's papers. What she found was a diary kept by her great-grandmother Martha Henderson, covering the years 1918 to 1920. The diary entries were mostly mundane, notes about weather, church attendance, the health of family members. But in March 1919, the tone shifted. On March 12th, Martha wrote, Lydia came home this evening very distressed. She would not speak of what troubles her, only that she has been given a task she wishes she could refuse. I told her she must do as the officials instruct, as we all must in these difficult times. She went to bed without supper. On March 15th, the day after the photograph was taken, Martha wrote, Lydia returned late this afternoon, exhausted and unwilling to speak. She said only that it is done, and she prays she will not be asked to do such a thing again. I did not press her. Some burdens are not meant to be shared. There were no further entries about Whitmore's distress, but in late May, Martha noted, Lydia has given notice that she will be leaving at term's end. She says she cannot remain here, that she must go somewhere where she is not known and can begin anew. I wish her well, though I fear she carries a weight that no distance will lighten. The diary confirmed what the official records obscured. Whitmore had been compelled to participate in something that caused her significant distress, something connected to the school and to the children in her care. The photograph was taken the day after she returned home in a state described as distressed, and the event was significant enough to require investigation by state health officials and to drive her from her position and her community. Salter reached out to the Pennsylvania State Archives to search for records related to Dr. Samuel Brennan and the State Health Board's activities in 1919. What she found was a series of internal memoranda discussing special measures taken in rural counties during the pandemic. The measures were vaguely described: management of affected populations, temporary custodial arrangements, documentation for state review. The memoranda made reference to cooperation with local school officials and the use of existing facilities for purposes that were necessary given the emergency conditions. One memorandum, dated April 1919, mentioned Clearfield County specifically, Woodland Road facility utilized as instructed. Documentation complete. No further action required at this time. The bureaucratic language concealed more than it revealed, but the message was clear. Something had taken place at the school, something that required documentation, something that officials wanted closed and forgotten as quickly as possible. Lydia Whitmore had been at the center of that event. She had been the teacher in the photograph, seated among children who should not have been in her classroom on a day when the school should have been empty. She had fulfilled duties that distressed her deeply, duties imposed by officials during a time of crisis, duties she was never allowed to refuse. And when it was over, she had left, not just her job, but her entire life in that community, carrying a burden that Martha Henderson rightly understood no distance could lighten. The photograph preserved her face, composed and still, performing the role expected of her. But it could not capture what she felt, what she knew, what she had been forced to do. That knowledge had disappeared with her, somewhere beyond the reach of census records and archives, into a silence that no amount of research could break. Chapter 6. Testimonies passed down in whispers. When Margaret Salter published her preliminary findings in a regional history journal in 2014, she included a request for anyone with family connections to the Woodland Road School area to contact her with stories or documents that might shed light on the 1919 photograph. The response was immediate and unexpected. Within weeks, she received letters and emails from descendants of families who had lived in the region during that period, and what they shared formed a pattern that official records had never captured. The stories were fragmented, passed down through generations with the distortions and gaps that oral history inevitably carries. But beneath the variations, a common thread emerged. Children being taken from their homes in the winter and spring of 1919, parents being told not to ask questions, families instructed to speak of certain days as if they had never happened. An elderly man named Thomas Brennan, no relation to the state health investigator, wrote from Ohio describing what his grandmother had told him when he was a boy. She had lived near the Woodland Road School as a child and remembered the day her younger brother was taken by a man in a dark coat who arrived at their farm with a county official. She said her mother cried but didn't fight them, Brennan wrote. Her father stood at the door and watched them take the boy down the road toward the school. When the boy came home that evening, he wouldn't speak about where he'd been or what had happened. Her mother told her never to ask him about it, and she never did. But she said her brother was different after that day. Quieter, afraid of things he'd never feared before. A woman named Catherine Rourke sent copies of letters written by her great-aunt, who had been a teenager in 1919. In one letter, dated 1952 and written to a cousin, the great-aunt mentioned the day they took the children for the counting. She did not elaborate, but she wrote that her mother had refused to let her younger siblings go, and that a county official had threatened to remove the entire family if they did not comply. Mother gave in, the letter said. What choice did she have? When the children came back, She made them wash and change clothes before she would let them sit at the table. She told us never to speak of it, that it was something shameful we had been forced to endure, and silence was the only dignity we could keep. The phrase, the counting, appeared in 3 other accounts from different families. No one explained what it meant, but the context suggested some form of assessment or documentation, a process that required gathering children in an official capacity. The shame associated with the event, mentioned by multiple sources, suggested that it involved something humiliating or invasive, something that parents understood as a violation but felt powerless to prevent. A man named Daniel Koska, whose great-grandfather had been a school board member in 1919, shared a family story about a meeting held in secret at a board member's home. "My great-grandfather didn't talk about his time on the board much," Koska wrote. "But my grandfather remembered him saying once that they'd been forced to make decisions no school board should ever have to make, that state officials had come down and told them what had to be done, and that they'd be held responsible if they refused. He said he carried the guilt of it the rest of his life, but he never said what the decision was. He only said it involved the school and the children, and that he prayed God would forgive him." Perhaps the most detailed account came from a woman named Mary Sutter, whose grandmother had been 10 years old in 1919 and had attended Woodland Road School. The grandmother, Ruth, had spoken about that spring only once, late in her life, when age and illness had loosened the grip of the silence she had maintained for decades. Ruth described being taken from her home by a county official and her teacher, Miss Whitmore, on a cold March day. She and other children from surrounding farms were brought to the school, which had been empty for weeks. They were lined up in rows and told not to speak. A photographer arrived and took their picture. But before the photograph, Ruth said, there had been other men in the room. Men in suits who walked along the rows and looked at each child carefully, sometimes asking them to open their mouths or hold out their hands. Ruth said she had been terrified, not understanding what was happening, only knowing that her mother had wept when she was taken and had held her tightly when she was returned home. She said the worst part was that Miss Whitmore, who had always been kind to her, looked so sad that day, Sutter wrote. She said the teacher's face was like stone, like she had to stop feeling anything in order to do what she was told to do. And she said that after that day, whenever she thought of school, she didn't think of learning her letters or playing at recess. She thought of standing in that cold room, being looked at by men she didn't know, feeling like something was being taken from her that she didn't have words to name. The accounts shared common elements. Children taken from their homes, parents coerced or threatened into compliance, official involvement that was never documented publicly, instructions not to speak of what happened, and a lasting sense of shame and violation that was passed down through families even when the specific details were forgotten or suppressed. One phrase appeared in multiple testimonies, spoken in different ways but carrying the same meaning. The day we had to prove. Prove what? None of the descendants could say with certainty, but the context suggested that the children had been gathered to demonstrate something: health, identity, eligibility for some form of relief or protection. The photograph was part of that proof, a visual record created not for memory or celebration but for documentation, for submission to authorities who needed evidence of compliance with some directive that was never meant to be part of the public record. The oral histories could not provide the precision of official documents, but they offered what documents often could not: the human experience of events that officials preferred to obscure. They gave voice to the fear and confusion of children who did not understand what was being done to them, to the helplessness of parents who could not protect them, and to the guilt of adults who participated in something they knew was wrong but felt they had no power to refuse. And they confirmed what the photograph itself suggested. The image was not an accident or an anomaly, but the visible trace of a systematic process, carried out across multiple families, organized by officials who left no clear record of their actions, and preserved in memory precisely because it could not be preserved in official documentation. The photograph and the stories whispered across generations were all that remained of a day that someone had decided should not be remembered, but that could not be entirely forgotten. The breakthrough came not from the county archives, but from the Pennsylvania State Archives in Harrisburg, where a researcher named Dr. Elaine Worthing had been cataloging materials related to public health responses during the 1918 to 1919 pandemic. Among the thousands of documents, quarantine orders, mortality reports, correspondence between health officials and local authorities, she found a folder that had been misfiled under Educational Facilities Maintenance, rather than under Health or Emergency Response. The folder contained memoranda from the State Health Board to county officials across Pennsylvania, dated between February and April 1919. The documents outlined a program called Emergency Child Assessment and Registration, designed to address what officials described as a crisis of displaced and vulnerable minors resulting from pandemic-related family disruption. The language was bureaucratic, carefully phrased to obscure the human reality it described. But the substance was clear. The pandemic had created thousands of orphaned, abandoned, or neglected children across the state. Families had collapsed under the combined pressures of death, illness, and economic catastrophe. Children were living in homes where parents were too sick to care for them, or in households where the primary wage earners had died and no means of support remained. Orphanages and charitable institutions were overwhelmed, unable to accommodate the sudden surge of children in need. The state response, according to the memoranda, was to conduct county-by-county assessments of children who were believed to be at risk or lacking adequate guardianship. Local officials were instructed to identify such children, bring them to designated facilities for health and welfare evaluation, and document their condition for state review. The documentation would be used to determine whether children should be placed in institutions, relocated to relatives in other counties, or allowed to remain in their current homes under county supervision. The facilities designated for these assessments were often schools, buildings that were closed due to pandemic restrictions but that had the space and infrastructure needed to gather and process groups of children. Teachers were enlisted to assist, as they already knew the local families and could help identify which children should be brought in for evaluation. County officials, health inspectors, and sometimes state representatives would conduct the assessments, examining children for signs of illness, malnutrition, neglect, or abuse. And photographers were hired to document the children, creating visual records that would be sent to state authorities as proof that the assessments had been conducted and that the children had been accounted for. The memoranda made no mention of Clearfield County specifically, but the description of the program matched exactly what had happened at Woodland Road School on March 14, 1919. The children in the photograph were not there for education. They were there to be evaluated, documented, and processed through a system designed to determine their fate in a crisis that had overwhelmed every existing support structure. Dr. Worthing found additional documents that shed light on how the program was implemented. In many cases, local officials were given significant discretion in identifying which children should be assessed. The criteria were vague: children believed to be at risk of harm or inadequate care, and the lack of clear standards meant that assessments were shaped by local prejudices, economic pressures, and personal judgments that were never reviewed or challenged. In some counties, assessments targeted children from immigrant families based on assumptions that non-English-speaking parents could not adequately care for their children or that certain ethnic groups were more likely to spread disease. In other counties, poor families were scrutinized more heavily, with children removed from homes that officials deemed insufficiently clean or orderly, standards that ignored the economic realities of rural poverty. And in some cases, the assessments became tools for settling local disputes, with officials using the program to remove children from families that were unpopular or politically disfavored in their communities. The program was never publicly announced. There were no newspaper articles explaining its purpose or extent. Families were not informed of their rights or given opportunities to contest decisions made about their children. The process was conducted quietly, with the understanding that public awareness would lead to resistance, and that the crisis was too urgent to allow for democratic deliberation or transparency. By summer 1919, the program had been quietly discontinued. The memoranda from June and July shifted to other concerns, with no final reports or assessments of whether the Emergency Child Assessment and Registration Program had achieved its goals. The children who had been evaluated were absorbed into various outcomes. Some placed in institutions, some returned to families, some relocated to distant relatives, and the records of those outcomes were scattered across county offices and state agencies, filed in ways that made comprehensive review nearly impossible. The photograph from Woodland Road School was one of the few visual records of the program that survived. Most counties did not hire photographers, or if they did, the photographs were not preserved. The Clearfield County image existed because someone, perhaps the photographer, perhaps a county official, perhaps Miss Whitmore herself, had kept it, storing it not in an official file but in a leather portfolio among legal documents, where it remained hidden and forgotten until a graduate student noticed a date that did not align with school closure records. What the photograph captured was the moment before decisions were made about the lives of 32 children. They had been brought to that room, arranged in rows, told to sit still while men examined them and a camera recorded their faces. Some of them would return home and resume their lives. Others would be taken away, sent to institutions or relatives, separated from families who had no means to fight for them and no advocate to challenge the judgments made against them. The children in the photograph did not know what was about to happen to them. They knew only that they had been taken from their homes, that adults in authority were making decisions beyond their understanding, and that they were powerless to resist. Their faces, frozen in stillness, carried the weight of that uncertainty. The fear of what was coming, the confusion of why they were there, and the instinctive knowledge that something fundamental had changed in their small worlds. And Miss Whitmore, seated at the center of the image, carried the burden of knowing exactly what the photograph meant. She had been forced to participate in a process that used her relationship with the children to facilitate their assessment and potential removal. She had been made complicit in a system that treated children not as individuals with families and rights, but as problems to be managed, risks to be evaluated, and resources to be allocated according to the judgments of officials who would never know their names or remember their faces. The classroom had become a processing center, the photograph a bureaucratic record, and the children themselves had been reduced to data points in a program that history had almost succeeded in forgetting entirely. As researchers worked to identify the children in the photograph, cross-referencing faces with school enrollment records, census data, and family genealogies, they found that most of the 32 students could be matched to families living in the Woodland Road School District in 1919. Some matches were definitive, photographs from later years that showed the same faces aged into adulthood, death certificates that confirmed names and birth dates, family histories that placed specific individuals in that school during that period. But one child could not be matched. The girl sat in the second row, third from the left. She appeared to be 7 or 8 years old, with dark hair pulled back from her face and a plain cotton dress that offered no distinguishing features. Her expression was no different from the others, serious, composed, faintly uncertain. There was nothing visually remarkable about her presence in the photograph. But when researchers compiled their list of identified students, her name was not on any school enrollment record from Woodland Road or any of the surrounding schools. She did not appear in the 1920 census for Clearfield County or any neighboring county. No family in the area claimed her as an ancestor or recognized her as a relative. She was simply there, seated among children whose identities were known. And then she was gone, leaving no trace in the historical record. Margaret Salter initially assumed that the girl had been missed in incomplete record-keeping. Rural school enrollment records from the period were notoriously unreliable, with teachers sometimes failing to document students who attended sporadically or who arrived and left within a single term. Census records also had gaps, especially for families that were transient or living in marginal circumstances. It was entirely possible that the girl had lived in the area briefly, attended the school for a few weeks, and then moved away with her family before the 1920 census was conducted. But the more Salter investigated, the less plausible that explanation became. She worked with genealogists who specialized in reconstructing communities from fragmentary records, tracing not just individuals but the networks of relationships that connected families in small rural areas. They examined every household within a 5-mile radius of the school, identifying every child of appropriate age who had lived in the area between 1918 and 1920. They cross-referenced birth records, death records, and family Bibles. They studied photographs from other local sources, looking for any child who resembled the unidentified girl. They found nothing. The girl in the photograph did not correspond to any known child from that time and place. The implications were disturbing. If she was not enrolled in the school and not living with a family in the area, then why was she in the photograph? The most likely explanation was that she had been brought in from elsewhere specifically for the assessment conducted on March 14th. The Emergency Child Assessment and Registration Program, as documented in the state memoranda, involved county officials identifying at-risk children, but the criteria for identifying such children were vague, and officials had significant discretion in determining who should be assessed. It was possible that the girl had been orphaned or removed from a family elsewhere in the county and was being housed temporarily in some facility while her case was decided. It was possible that she was the child of an itinerant family, migrant farm workers, traveling laborers, families without fixed addresses, who had fallen through the gaps in local record-keeping. It was possible that she had been identified as at risk by officials who then brought her to the school for documentation, intending to place her in an institution or with a foster family. But there was another possibility, one that researchers found difficult to voice but impossible to ignore. The girl might have had no legal identity at all. In the early 20th century, particularly in rural and immigrant communities, not all children were registered with the state at birth. Some were born at home without medical attendance, and parents never filed the necessary paperwork. Some came from families that distrusted government institutions and avoided official documentation whenever possible. And some children were deliberately hidden from official records, children born out of wedlock, children whose existence was inconvenient or shameful to their families, children whose parents had reasons to keep them invisible. If the girl was unregistered, if she existed in no birth certificate, no census record, no school enrollment ledger, then she was, in legal terms, a ghost. She could be moved, placed, or institutionalized without any documentation that would allow her to be traced later. She could be separated from any family or community that might claim her, and there would be no record that she had ever existed in the first place. The researchers found evidence that such children were not uncommon during the crisis of 1919. In the archives of several Pennsylvania institutions, orphanages, reformatories, state hospitals, they found intake records from that period listing children admitted without surnames, without birth dates, without any identifying information beyond age estimates and physical descriptions. The entries were marked foundling or unaccompanied minor, or simply unknown origin. These children had been gathered up during the chaos of the pandemic, brought in from homes that no longer existed or situations too complex or unsavory for officials to document clearly, and absorbed into institutional systems where their lack of legal identity made them invisible. One researcher, following leads into the records of the Pennsylvania Children's Home in nearby Du Bois, found an intake log from March 1919 that included an entry dated March 15th, the day after the photograph was taken. The entry listed a girl, age approximately 7, admitted from Clearfield County, no surname provided. The entry noted referred by County Assessment Program and included a brief physical description that matched the unidentified girl in the photograph. Dark hair, slight build, quiet demeanor. The log showed that the girl remained at the institution until June 1919, when she was placed with a private family in another county. No family name was recorded. No further documentation tracked her after that placement. She simply disappeared from the record, absorbed into a household somewhere, given a new name perhaps, or perhaps allowed to grow up without any official acknowledgement of who she was or where she had come from. The photograph, then, was the only proof that she had existed. For those few moments on March 14, 1919, she sat among other children in a cold classroom, and a camera captured her image. She was there, undeniably present, her face as real as any of the others whose names were known and whose lives were documented. But outside that photograph, she had no history, no identity, no trace in the official mechanisms that recorded human existence. She was a child who should not have been there, in the sense that no record acknowledged her presence, but she was there nonetheless. A silent witness to a process that treated children as administrative problems rather than human beings, and that left some of them so thoroughly erased from history that only a photograph accidentally preserved could prove they had lived at all. The photograph still exists, preserved now in the climate-controlled archives of the Clearfield County Historical Society. It has been digitized, analyzed, and published in historical journals and online databases. The faces of the 32 children have been studied by researchers, genealogists, and descendants who have traced their own family histories back to that moment in 1919. The image that was hidden for nearly a century is now accessible to anyone with an internet connection and a curiosity about the past. But accessibility does not equal understanding. Even with all the research that has been conducted, all the documents that have been uncovered, and all the family stories that have been collected, the photograph still resists complete explanation. There are facts that can be established: the date, the location, the context of the Emergency Child Assessment and Registration Program, the identities of most of the children, but the full truth of what happened in that room, and why it was deemed necessary, remains elusive. What is known is that the children in the photograph were gathered during a time of profound crisis, when institutions designed to protect and educate them were overwhelmed, and when officials were making decisions based on urgency and limited resources rather than careful consideration of individual circumstances. They were subjected to a process that treated them not as students or citizens but as subjects for evaluation, documentation, and potential removal from their families and communities. What is known is that the process was conducted without transparency or accountability, that families were coerced into compliance through threats and authority, and that the children themselves were given no voice in what was happening to them. They were told to sit still, to be quiet, to allow themselves to be examined and photographed, and then they were sent home or sent away, with no explanation of what the assessment meant for their futures. What is known is that the adults involved, Miss Whitmore, the county officials, the health inspectors, the photographer, were acting within a system that prioritized order and efficiency over compassion or individual rights. They were following directives from state authorities who believed that the crisis justified measures that would not have been acceptable in ordinary times. And when the crisis passed, the system moved on, leaving no comprehensive record of what had been done and no accounting for the long-term consequences of those actions. The photograph, taken as bureaucratic documentation, became something more through the accident of its preservation. It became a witness to a moment that officials intended to process and forget, a moment that disrupted the lives of children and families who had no power to resist or protest. It became evidence that history is not only what is officially recorded, but also what is hidden, obscured, or deliberately left unacknowledged. The children in the photograph did not choose to be there. They did not consent to being documented or assessed. They were brought into that room by forces beyond their control, positioned in rows, and told to hold still while a camera captured their images for purposes they did not understand. And for most of them, that day became something they carried in silence. A memory that was confusing, frightening, or shameful, something they did not speak about because they were told not to or because they had no language to explain what had been done to them. The photograph captures their faces in that moment, but it cannot capture what they felt or thought. Cannot tell us which children were allowed to go home and which were taken away. It cannot reveal what happened to the girl whose identity remains unknown, or what became of Miss Whitmore after she left the county in the summer of 1919. It cannot explain why officials believed that gathering children in a closed school during a pandemic, subjecting them to evaluation by strangers, and documenting them in a photograph was the appropriate response to a crisis. What the photograph can do is remind us that history is full of such moments. Actions taken by authorities who believed they were solving problems. Decisions made in the name of emergency or necessity that disrupted lives and left scars that were never officially acknowledged. It can remind us that the absence of documentation does not mean that something did not happen, only that those who held power chose not to record it, or chose to record it in ways that concealed more than they revealed. And it can remind us that photographs, even those intended as simple bureaucratic records, can become powerful testimonies when the context is understood. The image of 32 children and their teacher, seated in a cold classroom on a day when the school should have been empty, tells a story that official documents never fully captured. A story of fear, coercion, and the vulnerability of those who have no voice in the decisions that shape their lives. The children in the photograph are gone now, all of them long dead, their lives lived and concluded beyond the reach of historical inquiry. But their faces remain, preserved in an image that was never meant to be seen by later generations, an image that survived because someone understood, even in 1919, that what happened that day should not be entirely forgotten. The photograph is a record of a moment, but it is also a question, a challenge to look closely at history, to ask what is not being said, and to recognize that the silence around certain events is itself a form of evidence, a trace of experiences that were too painful, too shameful, or too dangerous to speak about openly. In that sense, the photograph is not just a historical artifact. It is a reminder that the past is always speaking, even when the words are missing, even when the official records are incomplete or misleading. It is speaking through the tension in children's faces, through the gaps in enrollment records, through the diary entries of a landlady who knew her boarder carried an unbearable burden. It is speaking through the oral histories passed down in whispers, through the misfiled memoranda in state archives, and through the single child whose name appears nowhere because she was never meant to have one. The photograph refuses to be ordinary because the moment it captured was not ordinary. It was a moment when the machinery of the state, overwhelmed by crisis, turned its attention to the most vulnerable, children who could not resist, families who could not refuse, and a teacher who was forced to participate in something she knew was wrong. It was a moment that those in power hoped would be forgotten, but that remains visible in the stillness of 32 faces, staring at a camera, waiting for something they could not name, bearing witness to a history that almost succeeded in erasing them entirely.